my channel. I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian turned homeschool mom. And in this video, we're going to look at this book. So this is Welcome to Josafina's World, 1824, growing up on America's southwest frontier. So America, in this case, it's talking about the North America, the continent, because as we know, Josafina, well, throughout her lifetime, she belonged to the Spanish Empire, the Mexican Empire, or rather it was just the country of Mexico. It was not an empire, and the American, and the United States of America. So, all before I think she turned, the Spanish-American War, I can't remember the date of it. Not something I learned, oddly enough. But again, I only went to 8th grade in high school in Arizona, Hawaii native, so didn't learn about that stuff. And I don't think it was covered. Really don't. May have been covered in elementary school, but nonetheless, this is really interesting. I do love these books. As I mentioned with the plays, I wish there were more. I'm moving on to Marie Grace and Cecile next month, and there's not a lot of stuff. So it talks about Josafina's Welcome to Josafina's World, where they're talking about their family and New Mexico. It talks about the cities made of gold, so it's talking about the Mexicans coming to the New Mexico area, fighting with the Native Americans and coming back and making friends, so they could live alongside each other. It talks about the different Native American tribes. Yes, there was Pueblo there, but they were a variety of different groups, and they had different languages. So as I probably brought up, if you want to go and look at my playlist for Kea, there's a lot of, as much as we like to, these days as white Americans, clump together Native Americans, even the specific groups that lives on the reservations, a lot of times, originally, they were a bunch of different groups, and they had different languages. But it talks about the different cultures. It talks about New Mexico itself. It talks about their homes made of adobe, how they did have an interior courtyard because it was dangerous. You're dealing with some traveling native tribes like the Apache and the Comanche and the Navajo who were coming through and who were raiding. And then, of course, you had snakes and bears and all sorts of things. So they built their homes to be protected. It talks about how they were busy and they would wrap up they always had a chapel inside their home because, again, these are Catholics. They are very, very Catholic. So it has a whole little thing on their religion here, and the different things. It talks about the beauty in the harsh land. So again, it's talking about some of the applique boxes and the different things that they made. It talks about loving Jewel, which is talking about babies. They had midwives, they were christened, they had godparents, so it was very important when a baby was born. Child mortality. It does talk about childhood, though children similar to, of course, Felicity and Caroline and Kea before them, they worked starting when they were very young. So they were doing things, girls were doing things around the house, boys were herding goats and different things, but they did have playtime. It does talk about the First Communion. Again, Catholic Church is where they devote themselves to the church. The girls, this is the girls, they typically do it at 12 and 13. It doesn't really mention the boys. It talks about courtship and marriage. Again, similar to not Caroline. In fact, not even entirely Felicity. Kea and Josafina, their parents would have picked their spouses. There was actually not a lot of time for the New Mexicans, boys and girls, to get together. They had dances, but otherwise, they just didn't see their family. They were busy. Then they talk about the fashion. Women were, unlike, say, Caroline and Felicity, who were not necessarily making their own clothing because of the fashions, the European fashions of the time. Women in New Mexico were wearing very simple clothing. They weren't necessarily wearing the stays that Caroline would have been wearing, and Felicity would have been wearing at this time, that even Kirsten and even Cecile and Marie Grace would have been wearing during their time period. So they weren't, that was not part of their fashions, though they did occasionally wear Spanish fashions. Looking at Josafina's time period, she probably would have, later in life, she would have worn more of the European clothing, which does require a mantua maker, someone who draped their clothing. But as a child and her family, she would have made her own very simple clothing. They were talking about keeping clean. I do have a mild issue with this because it does talk about how Americans and even Mexico wouldn't be bathing. That's not exactly it. They didn't take full-on baths. They would basically do what we would consider a sponge bath, so they would wipe themselves down, and they were clean. And they, though obviously similar to Kea, whose family was jumping in rivers to clean themselves, even in the cold. They were very cleanly. New Mexico, they did bring water and they did bathe. Often they bathed in the girls would bathe in the river, so they were actually very clean. It does talk about dealing with lice, and if clothing was too infested with lice, they laid it on an anthill, and the ants ate the lice. So that's kind of interesting. It does mention chamber pots in here. Basically, these were pots where you went to the bathroom and they would get rid of them. So it talks about the medicine. Again, they were using different herbal medicines. So it's very, very interesting. It does talk about smallpox. So in this case, apparently it was killing a lot of people by the time of Josafina's time. The King of Spain, I believe, or was it talking about the King of Spain? Yes, the Spanish king had learned about the inoculation process. Now, in England and Asia, they did this with cowpox. So they would essentially get scabs from cowpox, and you would put it on like a cut on a human. So they would get cowpox, which then inoculated them, prevented them from getting smallpox. In this case, what they did was the doctors would go around with children who had a mild case of smallpox. They would put a needle and thread through one of the pox of the children who were sick, usually orphans. Let's abuse the orphans. And then do that with healthy humans, so they would get a mild case, and then they would be immune. So it cut down death. So again, smallpox is the thing we got rid of. When humans are intelligent and want to actually do something, we can get rid of disease. Yeah. This is 2025. We're having measles outbreaks again. I did not make me happy. And whooping cough is showing up again because people are being idiotic. So, but nonetheless, it is unlikely that Josafina would have gotten smallpox. So that is a good thing. It talks about the life of danger. Again, you had bears, you had different animals, and of course, marauding Native Americans, because that's what they did. It does talk, the next page actually talks about a ghost story, the Weeping Woman, or La Lorena, who I've actually heard of, where apparently it was a legend of a woman who was with her children. They were out by the river. Her children got taken away by the water. She dived in. They all drowned. And now her spirit wanders around looking for her children. And if the children are not in at night, she's going to capture them. Typical ghost story to keep your children inside. It talks about the villages, because they do mention, we're not talking about Santa Fe, which is the larger city, but they had the little local villages with the local church. That is mentioned in Josafina's stories. It talks about the community celebrations, a lot of saints' days. And the Pueblos, who were, again, Native American people, they were different groups with different languages, but they're all kind of considered Pueblo because they lived in that area and they built their homes out of the adobe bricks. So it talks a little bit about them. It talks about how certain tribes would take, and the Spanish, the tribes would come and kidnap and steal things, including women and children, and the Spanish would do the same thing back. So it talks about a little bit of that. It talks about the El Camino Real, which is the royal road. So her grandfather is the one who's been walking along this. This is the trail between Santa Fe and Mexico City. So, and then it talks about a bit about Mexico City and what was going on there. It talks about all the goods they could find. It talks about women's rights, which is kind of interesting. Women in Mexico they did not give up their maiden names when they got married. They could own property. They could own materials that they could have their children inherit. They could run businesses, stuff that most women in Europe and in the rest of the Americas did not have the right to do. It talks about the Santa Fe Trail, which again is mentioned. This is when, after their break with Spain, Mexico was now able to trade with the United States, which they could not have done because Spain did not let them. So it talks about life on the trail. It talks about two famous people of Kit Carson and his wife, oddly enough, named Josafina. It talks about the Santa Fe market here. It talks about the becoming Americans when they're pretty much walked in and say, now we own the place. And then you had the Mexican-American War. So it talks a little bit about this. And that is, and then it kind of a peek into the future. So Josafina, like many New Mexicans, lived under 3 different governments. First Spanish, then Mexican, and then finally when she was, so Josafina would have been 33, American. The change stepped through Mexico in her lifetime. In 1850, Josafina was born. In 1815, Josafina was born into a world that had changed a little for more than 200 years, but in 1821, Mexico won independence and opened the borders. And by the time Josafina was 10, she was already using goods imported from the United States. By the time Josafina was raising her own children, she might have had glass windows and wallpaper. And then by the time she was a grandmother, she had probably traded her comfortable loose-fitting blouses and skirts for the tight corsets and full hoop skirts of the American fashions. But if Josafina had come back to New Mexico today, she would have been happy to find that although much had changed, many of the New Mexican traditions and customs of her childhood had lived on. So that's kind of cute and it goes into. So again, I do love these books. Fortunately, most of the rest of the dolls, I think, have them. I'm not sure about Kit and Julie, but Molly does, Samantha does, Kirsten does. Obviously, Cecile and Marie Grace do not. I'm going to be doing a lot of improvising with them for next month's videos, but I do love these. In fact, I think Kirsten does, but I'm not sure. I have to double check. I don't think she actually has one. But nonetheless, great book, great history, and it does give a good look into Josafina's life. So, that is the end of this video. If you like what you see, be sure to like and subscribe. This month, again, we are covering Josafina. We'll be moving into Cecile and Marie Grace, which are 2 wealthy African-American girls living in the 1850s in New Orleans. And then we'll be moving on to Kirsten, whose time period does overlap, but she's in Minnesota. And then we'll move on to our American Civil War and slavery with Addie. And then I think we're doing the massive jump into Samantha, and then Rebecca, and then Kit, and onward through history. So, again, if you like what you see, be sure to like and subscribe, and check out the rest of the channel. Thank you.